Hello and welcome to Kaleidoscope, where we are here today with another topic and an interesting author. This is a riveting book called Blood for Blood by senior veteran journalist Terry Milewski from Canada. He's worked for CBS for over 40 years, and of course, a very close chronicler of the Khalistani movement as it's panned out across the decades and also in Canada, his home country. Thank you, Terry, so much for joining us this evening. Namaste. I first of all, I want to thank you for writing this book. As we were discussing prior to going live, that I come from a generation where we were much too young when the bombing happened, and so much of our history is based on just books like yours, really, which are far and few between, and it gives us a real insight into how this problem really for India originated and how it's been handled and what we face today. Like very recently, which we saw, the issue explode once again with the farmers protests, sorry, in the country, and the subsequent backlash that took place in Canada and things of that nature. So I think this remains a burning topic, and I really want to thank you for shedding some facts and some light on it, because we live in a post-truth world, and a lot of times it becomes very difficult to sieve out the truth from the propaganda.
Yes, I think you put your finger on it. The post-truth world, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, in fact, is just that.
Right.
There's a counterfactual story being told.
I wanted to,
So we can talk about that if you like.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I wanted to actually start by going back a little and asking you about your interest in this particular subject.
Well, I was asked to write the book because I've been going on about it for so many years. I went to cover the Kanishka bombing in 1985 in Ireland, and it just never got out of my head. I felt like this was not only an epic failure of the authorities, the police and the security agencies who failed to stop the bombing, but also a failure of the political class in tolerating and pandering to the extremists who perpetrated the bombing, and also a failure by the justice system in failing to give the families of the victims a full measure of justice, not even in 30 years. And finally, a failure by people like me in the media who failed to tell the story. We never really told the story of what happened here and why, and who messed up. And so much has been forgotten, and now there is this disinformation campaign, which is telling the opposite of the truth about what happened, and they're getting away with it because people say, "Oh, it's a long time ago. Forget it. It was far away, and it's not our problem, and that's all ancient history." Well, apparently it isn't, because people are still telling lies about these events and promoting a completely counterfactual version of history.
And you sort of in your book you do discuss this, and I'm very curious about this. This fascination or this long affair that the Sikh diaspora in Canada, in particular, has had with the idea of Khalistan, which is pretty much a finished idea in India, but somehow tends to continue and linger and get some sort of robust support as well in certain pockets of Canada amongst the Sikh diaspora. How do you explain this?
There are various different explanations offered. I'm not sure that any one of them is complete. One is that, of course, the Sikh diaspora was self-selected to be composed of people mainly who didn't want to live in India. Of course, the people who moved out of India are the ones who didn't want to live there. So that's a simple explanation, but there's a great deal of truth in it. In addition to that, a lot of those people live in the past. They were banned, many of them, the most extremist Khalistanis, were banned from visiting India. They didn't see that India has changed. It's not 1984 anymore in Punjab, where there's just a microscopic fraction of the electorate in Punjab, maybe 1/3 of 1%, a negligible fraction of people, of millions of Sikhs who live in Punjab, vote for the only separatist party that runs anymore. They haven't had any success in 30 years now. Yet in the diaspora, the dream is still alive. So there's one other explanation, though, and that is self-interest. The small minority of Khalistanis, we're not talking about Canadian Sikhs in general, we're talking about a very small active minority. That minority covets political power. They want political influence, and they want control of the gurdwaras and the money that comes into the donations that come into the gurdwara. Significant, large amount of money. And they want political influence by organizing their people to vote en bloc, en masse, for politicians who agree to look the other way, smile and wave at the Baisakhi parade every year as the floats go by, decorated with the pictures of gun-toting Khalistani assassins and martyrs. And so there's some self-interest involved, as well as the other factors, which I think goes some way to explaining why an idea which is functionally dead in India still survives in the diaspora.
Absolutely, and that to me also remains very surprising. In fact, earlier we were also speaking of the younger generations of Canadian Sikhs in the diaspora who seem to support this idea of Khalistan. And I don't know if you caught this, Terry, but about 2 days ago in Lahore, Ranjit Singh's statue was destroyed. And the government of India lodged an official complaint. So one really wonders, I mean, what are the Khalistanis thinking if they think Pakistan is going to be a friend as far as they're concerned?
Yeah, I don't think that was a Khalistani. I think that was a jihadist
Yes,
of
yes.
some kind, or maybe just a nut, who knows. And that's the third time. That statue's only been there for 2 years, and it's been attacked and vandalized 3 times already. So, but your point is correct, that this hardly looks like Pakistan is the great friend of the Khalistanis. Pakistan, where Sikhs are still being driven out in a sort of leftover partition exercise, where Sikh, as well as Hindu and other girls from other minorities, are kidnapped, forcibly married off to Muslim men, forcibly converted to Islam. And yeah, it's no wonder that the population of Sikhs in Pakistan is declining rapidly. But you also made a good point when you brought up the younger generation. I'll tell you a short story which illustrates just how bad it is in Canada. A friend of mine whose father was murdered because he was a witness in the Kanishka bombing. They silenced him for good. And his son told me a story about a young girl, maybe 14, 15 years old, a Sikh girl, who asked him, why do you always refer to the Air India bombers as terrorists? They're heroes, she said. They're heroes. And my friend was amazed. What do you mean? What about the victims? What about the victims' families? What are you thinking? And she said, oh, I didn't think of that. Well, there are people today, not 35 years ago, there are people today in Canada, in the Sikh diaspora, who are being brought up to think like that, who are being brought up not to realize that blowing up a civilian airliner full of completely innocent people who have nothing whatsoever to do with the Khalistani struggle might be a bad thing. It's amazing, isn't it?
It is. That's certainly no role model for anyone. And it's kind of surprising that should be the case. In India in particular, Terry, a few years ago, we were appalled, and I'm not talking so much about the state, although the Prime Minister Trudeau did get a very cold reception, with the fact that someone who was part of his party on an official tour to India was somebody who'd been accused of an attempted assassination.
Yes, I mean, it was an astonishing event, really. This is, you're referring to Prime Minister Trudeau's visit to India in 2018, which went very badly, not least because, as you say, a member of the Prime Minister's party who should have been never allowed anywhere near any of these official events, who was, in fact, uh, not just a suspected, but a convicted Sikh wannabe assassin. He tried to kill a cabinet minister from Punjab, Malkiat Singh Sidhu, in 1986 on Vancouver Island. He told his parole officer, "Yeah, I was the one who did the shooting. I shot him twice." He survived. He was later assassinated 5 years later. But the point of the story is that this man, also suspected, by the way, in the near fatal beating of Ujjwal Assange, a moderate Sikh and a very successful politician in British Columbia and Canada, he was beaten for the crime of asking for less violence. He was against violence, and for that he had his head beaten in with an iron bar. And the man who was suspected in that case and who was convicted in the attempted assassination showed up on my cell phone in pictures from Trudeau's visit to India, posing with the Prime Minister's wife at a glittering diplomatic reception. And at another reception the previous day in Mumbai, as well as in New Delhi. So a convicted Khalistani terrorist had the inside track on Trudeau's visit to India. Well, how do you think the Indian government responded to that? Of course, they were appalled. They said, "Wake up! What are you doing?" And of course, they realized far too late, oh, this is going to look bad. Well, guess what? This is the real story. They didn't realize beforehand that this would look bad. They didn't think of that. Just like the young girl who didn't think about the victims in the Air India bombing of 1985. The Liberal Party and the Prime Minister's team did not realize, and the High Commissioner, the Canadian High Commissioner in New Delhi, who sent out the invitations to these events, did not realize that, you know what, this is not the kind of guy we want posing with the Prime Minister at a diplomatic reception. This is not going to help Canadian-Indian relations.
Which makes us really ask the question, Terry, is there part of it is, of course, the cynical politics, which you've mentioned in your book. And, the Canadian politician is only interested in winning their votes. But what about, is there any ideological support from the Canadian perspective, from the state's perspective, as far as this movement is concerned?
Oh, no, that would involve, no. That would involve thinking. There's no ideology. There's the Canadian political parties, and I'm speaking of all of them, by the way, left, right, and center. They all play the same game. They all play footsie with the Khalistanis. There's no thinking and ideology that somehow they're in favor of independent Sikh states or they should be torn out of it. None of them believe that. They just believe in getting reelected. They just believe they don't want to antagonize an important and active political lobby group, an ethnic lobby group. They don't want to do that. It just happens to be the Sikhs, but the substance of the issue doesn't interest them in the slightest.
That's really sad, because I think it does impact relations between the two countries in a very negative way. And we have no areas of conflict but for this. And this is a very important issue for us in India here.
You're right, and so it should be. And if you ask me, I think the Indian government through the years, and I'm speaking now going back to Manmohan Singh and before, it seems to me the Indian government has taken a pretty mild attitude to this. Of course, India had its own problems with the battle against Khalistanis. Thousands of people were killed. In Canada, we had hundreds killed. It was on a smaller scale. If we speak of the Kanishka bombing, which is the singular achievement of the Khalistani movement in Canada. But let me mention another thing, which, I mean, this is what the Indians to this day put up with and tolerate in their Canadian friends.
Yes.
I refer to the martyr pictures of the mastermind of the Air India bombing, a cold-blooded mass murderer, Kalinda Singh Parmar, who organized and led the movement to put bombs on Indian planes leaving Vancouver. He was a Canadian citizen, didn't speak much English, but he was or French, but he was a Canadian citizen, and he and his gang and the Baba Khalsa put 2 bombs on planes leaving Vancouver. One of them blew up on the ground in Tokyo. It was supposed to be 2 explosions on opposite sides of the globe, but the connections didn't time out right, and one of them went off on the ground. The other one went off in the air over the Irish Sea, with the death of 329 innocent civilians. And the mastermind of that plot is memorialized and glorified in Canada every day with a life-size poster, a martyr poster, on the side of a very important Gurdwara temple in Surrey, British Columbia, which is the second largest city in British Columbia. And it stays there. And you don't hear politicians saying, you know what, I'm not going to your Vaisakhi parade until you take that down. This is an abomination. It's an obscenity. It's the glorification of mass murder, and no more, no less. And of course, there's this constant disinformation campaign which goes on, say, oh, no, he was innocent. This is what the Khalistanis say about that. So he was innocent. And you have to wonder, well, if he was innocent, what exactly the bomb maker was convicted, spent most of his life in prison. And he said, and we can prove, and it's established beyond any shadow of a doubt, that he made the bombs for Parmar, that Parmar was the guy who asked him to build the bombs. Mm-hmm. So his guilt is not in doubt. And yet they have this disinformation campaign, oh, well, he was innocent. And if they repeat it often enough, some people believe it. Mm-hmm.
You also tracked that investigation when he was going to test the bomb, and how I think it was the RMP which was following him, and then sort of lost the ball on that one. And the entire investigation was also botched up. And the other interesting comparison that you make is with that time in Northern Ireland with the IRA and the fatalities that incident in history caused, and with the Khalistani movement in India. And the numbers are just so disparate. But if you think in terms of the global impact,
it's true. That's another of the forgotten parts of this, is just how bloody this episode was, not just in Indian history, but in world history. I mean, a lot of the history of the last 100 years has been written by white people. And so we've tended in the British and the American media generally to focus on the Irish troubles, which dragged on, as you know, for 30 years and killed about 3,500 people, civilians, police, military, all kinds. And it was notable for its savagery. Well, I did the math. The insurgency by Khalistani militants in India, principally in Punjab, and I'm not counting the Air India bombing and other incidents elsewhere around the globe. That insurgency took 21,000 lives. That's 6 times as many as the Irish Troubles in less than half the time. So I think people have lost focus a little bit on just how ghastly this insurgency was. I mean, there are stories that it's just too long it would make the book too long to even skate over some of the incidents. I mean, just one reported by Human Rights Watch and Physicians for Social Responsibility, for example, of Sikh fighters, gunmen showing up at a family home of a Sikh policeman in Punjab, getting all the members of the family, a dozen of them, to line up against the wall, and shot them for the crime of having a relative who was in the Punjab police. Mm-hmm. And one girl escaped. She slipped around the wall and ran out the back and hid in the next building. They chased her down, they found her, and they shot her. That's what was going on, not just that one time, but routinely in Punjab during the Khalistani insurgency. Now, of course, what we hear about is all the terrible human rights violations, and there were human rights violations by the Indian government, as though there weren't any by our side. Oh, no, none at all. Well, that's dishonest. And that's why I call it disinformation.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I was keen to ask you about was, of course, you mentioned that you even interviewed Indira Gandhi, who we know was subsequently assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards at the post Operation Blue Star. I wanted to know a little bit about that interaction you had with her as a journalist back in the day, and how long was it before she was assassinated?
That was in 1967.
Oh, a long time back.
I hope I don't look that old, but I am. And I was on basically a jaunt with some university friends. We drove a bus from London to New Delhi. And for some reason, never mind how, we had an introduction to the Prime Minister's office, and a group of us were ushered in to meet Mrs. Gandhi. And I was picked to sort of interview her. At least that's what I thought it was, an interview. It really meant a series of disconnected speeches by her in which she wisely ignored my dim-witted questions, which were not very well prepared. She just said what she wanted to say anyway. And what she said, which was quite striking, was, and these words stay with me even today, she said, "Pity poor India. Pity poor India." And what she was getting at, the point she was making, was that us pampered students from Oxford University who had arrived in India to have a look around, we didn't understand how difficult her job was, governing a state, a nation of such variety and of such poverty and illiteracy. And she told us a story, for example, this I remember clearly. She told us a story to illustrate how out of touch Indians were, how uneducated, how backward her country was. She told a story of how, as a girl, she had visited a small rural village with her father, Pandit Nehru, in a helicopter. She had descended upon the village in a helicopter, and she said the villagers had never even seen a car. They'd never even seen an automobile. And she said they thought I was a god. And that certainly did illustrate how backward her country was, or at least some rural parts of it. But what stayed with me also was the gleam in her eye. She didn't entirely dislike the idea of being considered a god.
And the other thing that I was very keen on knowing about was, how are you received in Canada? Because this would be a difficult book to write, and also, I mean,
Well, it's a challenge. It certainly keeps me busy because there's always some lawsuit by some group that feels aggrieved. How can Terry say these terrible things? And these lawsuits always turn out to be nothing. They've got no case. It's performative. There are performative lawsuits designed to impress the easily impressed. Oh, well, Terry's being sued. Oh, well, there must be something wrong. And then, years later, they drop the lawsuit, and not one of them has ever gone to court, in fact. So it's not boring, let's put it that way. But I'll give you an illustration of it. It's not. I'm not their main problem. The government of India is their main problem. And recently, very recently, within the last few weeks, a group called Sikhs for Justice, which is campaigning for a referendum, as you probably know, on Sikh sovereignty, they tweeted an attack on the Indian High Commissioner in Canada, India's top diplomat in Canada. They demanded that he be expelled from Canada for his hate mongering. And what was this hate mongering? The High Commissioner had put out a statement on the anniversary of the Kanishka bombing condemning Khalistani terrorism. And you sort of stop and think, okay, what's wrong with that? And it was quite serious. This tweet came from the leader of Sikhs for Justice, Gurpatwant Singh Panun, who's a lawyer, saying he wants all Sikhs to bombard Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada with emails demanding the expulsion of the Indian High Commissioner for this terrible hate mongering that he had done by deploring Khalistani terrorism. Never said anything about Sikhs, never even mentioned Sikhs. And this is characterized by Sikhs for Justice as hate mongering against Canadian Sikhs. Well, most Canadian Sikhs want nothing to do with the separatist cause, like Sikhs everywhere.
Right.
It was a quite a demented tweet, if the truth be told, and it disappeared without trace. And I doubt that very many emails went to Trudeau demanding the ouster, the expulsion of the Indian High Commissioner. But that gives you a sense of how desperate the Khalistani movement seems. But it also tells you they're still active, they're still alive, they're still at it.
They are. And during the recent farmers' protests that I mentioned a little while ago, there was Rihanna who was tweeting in support of the farmers, and she's never spoken of India. She's never sort of engaged in any way. And suddenly she came forward with this tweet in support, and you saw the Khalistanis kind of take over the protests. And whatever genuine elements were associated with that protest were washed away because it was hijacked by this strange collaboration, of course, of the Pakistani bots on social media, then the Khalistanis in Canada specifically, and as well as the leftist sort of combine that came together to kind of kept stirring the pot.
Yeah,
and this leads.
Well, I was just going to say. I'm sorry, you finish your question.
This really leads me to that whole thing that you speak about misinformation and how coordinated that campaign is.
Yeah, I mean, what strikes me about this is that, and I'm sorry to say this, the Indian government hasn't been doing a great job in this propaganda war. In many respects, the Khalistanis have been winning. They've been disciplined. They've been well-funded. The diaspora has been very successful in general. There's a lot of professionals. They're making good money in the West, in Canada and the United States, and they don't hesitate to contribute to what they think is a good cause. And they've been vilifying the Indian government with tales, for example, like the Indian government blew up their own plane. The Kalaidoscope bombing was a false flag operation. It was blown up by the Indian government, and the Sikhs had nothing to do with it. Complete baloney. I mean, there's no evidence for this whatsoever. We know who blew up Air India, and it certainly wasn't Indian agents. They had nothing to do with the Indian government. Talvinder Singh Parmar spent every day of his life damning the Indian government to hell. And the Indian government denounced him to the Canadian government as a wanted murderer, tried to get him extradited long before the bombing, which is not exactly how you treat your own secret agent if he was supposed to be acting for the Indian government. None of it makes any sense, this idea that the Indian government blew up their own plane. But believe it or not, a lot of people in the diaspora do believe this. They actually said, in fact, there's some evidence that some Sikh politicians in Canada at least pretend to believe this, at least as a plausible theory, and they wonder why the Canadian authorities have not properly investigated the theory that the Indian government blew up their own plane. And this is always said in very conspiratorial tones and with no evidence whatsoever, and a mountain of hard evidence to contradict it. But I must say to you that in many respects, judging by the success that the Khalistani movement in Canada certainly has had in passing on their ideas to the new generation, then they've done a pretty good job, and perhaps better than the Indian government.
Oh yes, I mean, and as you point out in your book, the first time there was an announcement of Khalistan, it was nothing less than the New York Times in 1971.
Yep.
So I mean, they've been strategic right from the beginning, and unfortunately, there is a Western media bias that very often refuses to see things from the perspective of the Indian state, and especially at this time, when we have a government. What do you make of the present response, the present day response to this issue, and what do you think could be done going forward?
Well, I have one beef with the Indian government, which is not very popular, perhaps, and that is that they have banned the referendum and they have criminalized those who advocate for the referendum. Now, I have no problem with banning people who are violent or can be shown to be recommending violence or participating or funding violence. No problem there. But there are people who believe in an independent Sikh state who are nonviolent. And to criminalize merely advocating the referendum puts India in a bad spot. It's a propaganda success for the Khalistanis. Aha, you see? Now we can explain why not many people are voting in our referendum. You see, it's the persecution of the Indian government. Aha, gotcha. Well, it is a gotcha. And if you look at the voting figures, I mentioned a moment ago, I think that in the last Punjab elections in 2017, the separatists got 0.3% of the vote. All right, so none of the above did better than the separatists. I mean, it was a pitiful performance. And it's been that way for 30 years. Nobody votes for the separatists. But here we have a situation where the Indian government could win the referendum easily with one hand tied behind its back. I mean, look at the results. You're afraid of 0.3% of the population that they might vote in favor. Well, okay, so let them. I mean, what does India have to fear? What does the mighty rising nation of 1 billion plus people, what does it have to fear from people saying, vote for an independent state? Let them. It shouldn't be illegal to just say, vote for an independent state, in my view.
Yes, I think part of the issue really lies in a point you made earlier, where you said that we are an immensely diverse country, and we have linguistic differences, cultural differences. There's if you live in the north, sometimes it's very difficult to find things in common with people in the south. But for this Indian identity, so I think doing a referendum in one state could lead to an avalanche of these referendums and total chaos, because
You're
that's
right,
just
of
the country
course.
we are. You know, I
You're
I, I
right,
come from a small hill state. I come from a small hill state, which is quite it was small but very opinionated about its identity and its land as well. So that's sort of the trouble we run into in
Yeah,
India.
yeah, it's
But
the old thin end of the wedge argument. Is you let one, then they'll all want independence. Well,
yes,
yeah, but that doesn't mean they'll get it. If you just let them have the vote, and then you will expose them, because the chances are overwhelming that the vote will prove everything that we've been saying. I mean, it'll just prove that there's no support. Well, I mean, that's when the whole movement loses steam. If the Indian government wanted to take the steam out of this, they would let it happen. And then if the next one comes along and says, okay, well, now we want independence, okay, deal with that one. I mean, it's a big mature country now. It's not, some third world dictatorship.
no, that's true. And why doesn't Canada act on this? That's something that we often ask. That why is it allowing these kind of actions to take place? Like we discussed, even during the farmers' protest, Indians were attacked. And
Well,
one was the attacker was Jagmeet Singh's brother-in-law, was he?
yes, that's right. There was an incident of an alleged assault. But the real answer to your question lies in the previous answer. In Canada, why don't they act? Why don't they stop these Khalistani activities? Well, the answer is free speech. What's wrong with that? That's something that Indians used to believe in, and Canadians too. And if somebody wants to put up a poster and say Khalistan Zindabad, and let's have a vote on Sikh sovereignty, there's nothing illegal about that in Canadian law. We have Quebec separatists in Canada. We had a vote on it. It happened that we won. The nationalists in Quebec narrowly lost their case, and the country is still in one piece. We survived. It's still a prosperous country.
Were they violent, Terry? Were they violent? I'm sorry, I'm not.
Well, the Front pour la Libération de Québec, the FLQ, that was a terrorist organization. Yes, there was a notorious killing. That was an extreme wing of the movement, few in number, and it gave the then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, the father of the present Prime Minister, a reason to send in the army. When that happened, when it got violent, then he sent in the troops. But that was a very long time ago. That was long before the more recent referendum. That was in the 90s. Now, my point is simply that Canada puts up with Khalistani lobbying and propaganda because it's got no laws to prevent that. And in my view, it should not have laws to stamp out free speech. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's no law that politicians have to be silent when they go to the Vaisakhi parade and they see on the Gurdwara, on the wall of the Langa Hall in Toronto, or on the side of the Gurdwara in Surrey, British Columbia, they see martyr portraits hailing the Air India bombers as martyrs and heroes and a model for Sikh youth. Well, why don't? There's no reason. They've got free speech as well, right? The politicians have free speech. They could stand up and say, "I'm not going to any Gurdwara that's going to play that game. You can't glorify mass murderers and expect me to show up and smile and wave. No, thank you. The hell with you." They could say that, and they don't, and that I think is shameful.
Thank you so much for saying that. And, this is run overtime. Usually we're a 25-minute show, but it's just been so interesting speaking with you. And I just want to, again, highlight the book. I think my internet's a little sketchy right now, but Blood for Blood is available on Amazon. It's available in all your bookstores. I picked it up at my local bookstore. So if you are venturing out during this pandemic, please go to a bookstore and pick it up. Otherwise, it's just as easily available on Amazon. And Terry, I hope once the pandemic is behind us, you will visit India, maybe do a lecture series in some of our universities and colleges, and discuss your book at greater length with the younger generation. Like I said, there's a whole generation that has no idea about this, but is confronted with the burning embers of this dispute every once in a while, and often because it comes from Canada.
Well, any excuse to visit, I will gladly take. I've been rather sentimental about India ever since that trip in 1967 when I interviewed Indira Gandhi. I'm not quite over it yet. So I look forward to
that. Is that the last time you were in India? Was that in 67?
Yeah. That was my first
trip.
Oh,
wow. Well, we must work that out once the pandemic is behind us.
Yes, we'll do that. And thank you for your interest. I'm sorry my answers were all about 25 minutes long.
No, that's fine. Thank you so much. And everybody, welcome to the next episode next week. Do read this book. You're sure to be greatly informed. And thank you once again for joining us for Kaleidoscope. And we'll be back next week, same time, same place. Thank you and goodbye.